Hello everyone. Hey, I picked up some great lumber from the lumber store last week. It's been drying in my shop for a week. It was straight and flat when I picked it up, and look at it now, a week later. Look at, there's a propeller starting right there, and look at the bow in this one. And if you think it's bad this way, have a look at that. It's bowed in both directions. So today I'm going to answer all the questions about why we don't make quality furniture out of 2x4s. So last week when I was at the lumber store, I decided to pick up 3 pieces of 2x4 for this video, and I brought them home and I've let them dry out. Now I actually took my moisture meter to the lumber store, which I do very often, and when I checked these 2x4s at the store, they were 18%. And because it's been hot and dry here, they're down to about almost 17% now. So it's dried off 1%. Is that enough? We'll look and see. Today I'm going to talk about 3 things. I'm going to talk about the state of the wood. I'm going to talk about joinery for working with this kind of lumber. And I'm also going to talk about finishing and what can happen. When I got to the lumber store and I walked over to the lift of 2x4s that they had out on the floor, it was marked SPF. And that stands for spruce, pine, fir. And what that means is in that lift, there could be any mix of any or all of those woods. Now, I talked about this in a past video, and now's a great time. If you haven't already subscribed to my channel, now's a good time to do it because a lot of these videos that I make, they're sort of all interrelated. So when I looked at the pile of 2x4s, I could see that anything I could see that was easily accessible was all spruce. And that's another thing that you need to be able to do, is to be able to identify different species of wood. Because I was looking for fir. Fir is a much stronger wood. Spruce is light, not as strong, but perfect for building, which is what these 2x4s are built for: building houses, garages, barns, those kinds of things. But I picked them anyway because that's all they had, and that's where I measured the moisture content. Moisture content in wood is a very important factor to know and to understand. Now, going back to when they cut this lumber down, these trees are cut, they're normally around 35 to 40% moisture content. Way too high to do much with. After they're milled, they're put into a kiln and they are partially kiln dried. And they're kiln dried down to between 17 and 19%, and most often closer to 19. Now, the reason they don't go below 17% is because when you go below 17%, some of the knots that are in the material, there are 2 different kinds of knots. They're what they call an inclusion knot, which is what we call a tight knot, and the other knot is what we call a loose knot. And loose knots often come loose below 17%. So if they dry the wood below 17%, those loose knots start to become loose. And what that does is it drops the grade of the lumber. So just having a moisture content of 17% or higher means they can grade the wood a little bit higher, means they can get a little bit more money for it. But when we get it home and dry it out, those knots that were sometimes, not all of them, if they're tight knots, they don't move. But if they are loose knots and we dry them below 17%, guess what? They start coming loose, and then we have to cut around them or fill them or do other things with them. So why is moisture content important? And here's why. When you're cutting wood, pretend this is the end of a log, and these straight up and down lines are where a saw would cut through them. And I've simplified this, but you'll get the idea. So if you make a cut on the outside here and you cut all the way down and this part of the log falls off, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to make a cut like this and that part. So now you've got this middle part here, and that will go back through the mill. And guess what? You end up cutting a 2x4 out of what was this part of the wood at one time. Now, why this is important is because when wood dries, it contracts. The wetter wood is, the more the moisture takes up space. And as this wood dries, it gets it shrinks a little bit. And this particular cut that I'm showing you, it will shrink a lot in this area. It will shrink a little bit in this area, and the lengthwise, straight up and down the log, it basically doesn't shrink at all. But this is our biggest concern right here. These, where am I here? This side here and this side here. And you'll see in a minute why that's important. So when we're at the lumber store and we're pulling 2x4s off and we're looking down them, making sure we get them all straight, and we go deeper and deeper into the bundle, and the deeper you go, the wetter the wood is, because it doesn't have any way for the wood to the moisture to come out of the wood and expand anymore. So the deeper you go in there and you get nice straight pieces in there, sometimes it's a bad thing, because when the wood dries, not all pieces, and here's the problem, when some wood dries, depending on where that wood has grown or what the genetics of the tree are, it can twist or warp or bend, and you don't know that when it's wet, because when it was wet, it was cut nice and straight. And when it got piled up into the other wood and all the wood is around it and it's all strapped together, it stays nice and straight. But when that bundle is cut open and the wood can kind of go, and it starts to mold into the way it was grown, that's when it starts to bend and warp. And we don't really know that until we get it home and start drawing it out, because we need to get that wood to not expand by time we get starting to put it into a project of something, because we don't want it to expand or to contract after we've built it. So as it turns out, 19% moisture content in construction grade lumber is just fine, because most buildings are put together with nails, and when you drive nails into green wood and it shrinks a bit, it actually grabs the nail a little bit better, so it actually makes the building a little bit stronger. Not so much with furniture. When you're using green lumber making furniture, there's some other principles at work. And one of the main ones is when wood dries out, and because it's furniture and it's inside, it's going to dry out a lot quicker. And wood always dries out quicker on the end grain. That's why we end seal end grain in wood. But it dries out quicker on end grain, and what happens when it does that? It cracks. If you go around and look at 2x4s that maybe you've had inside, you'll find cracks in the end. So that's one of the problems with wood. As it dries out, it cracks. The other thing, and I'm going to show you that in a moment when we get on to joinery, how the shrinking is a problem with joinery as it shrinks. The other thing with wet wood is in the finishing. And we're going to talk more about that when we get on. But when you finish wet wood, there's lots of problems that come up there. So let's move into joinery and have a look at some options there. Okay, let's take a moment to talk about joinery. How do we join 2x4s and construction grade lumber together? Well, the weakest joint, and this isn't just with softwood, this is anything I've ever tested, me and many other people, pocket holes are typically the weakest joint. It's a mechanical joint, and even with gluing, it still is one of the weakest joints that you'll put together. Now, the other problem with using 2x4s or construction grade lumber, now that you're putting steel in there, now you're inviting more cracking to take place. And of course, as you screw the wood in, again, you're inviting more cracks to come into place. The other thing that's happening with this is when this wood dries, now this top piece of lumber, it's going to dry and it's going to shrink. And what's going to happen? It's going to separate from this bottom piece here, and it's going to leave a very fine crack in there, or a gap, I should say, in there. Now, you could go along and re-tighten these. That would bring that gap together, but you'll have to do that with all the joints that are similar to this. So the pocket hole is your weakest joint. The next joint that I'm going to talk about, there's two of them actually, and it's the dowel. And the thing that I like about using dowels, of course, with pocket holes, you end up with these ugly pocket hole things all over your furniture. At least with a dowel, you have a hidden joint. So a dowel is similar in many ways to a mortise and tenon, but nobody that I know of ever makes mortise and tenon joints with 2x4s or construction grade lumber. And the reason is it's so time consuming that nobody would do it. If you're going to take the time to make mortise and tenon joints, you would be using a much better, much higher quality wood. But you could do that. It's much easier to make it with dowels, and now you have a hidden joint that is glued in. You may get a gap in there if this wood shrinks. It really depends how that is, but typically you're not going to get that gap, and here's why. You're going to glue this to, these two are going to be glued together. This wood is still going to shrink, but the shrinkage is going to come from the top. It will shrink down because it will stay, the glue joint will stay in here, but the wood will still shrink, but it will come down from the top and leave that alone. So that's one of the things that you could, another option for a joinery. Now, the very best joint that you can make with 2x4s and construction grade lumber like this is the lap joint. And the reason is you've got such a wide area to put glue on there, and it fastens together very strongly and it stays there. You don't even need to put any mechanical screws in there. You might be able to pin that just to hold it until the glue dries. But you still might get some cracking. You still might get a bit of a gap in here. It's hard to say. It really depends. All of these depend, of course, on the amount of moisture that you have in your wood. But for sure, the lap joint is the strongest of all of the joints. Okay, let's take a moment now to talk about finishes. What's the best finish to put on wet 2x4s? Well, the worst you can put on is anything that is a polyurethane or a varathane. This is a top finish. It's a polyurethane, varathane, basically the same thing. And right here beside it, I have a oil-based dye, or a stain rather. And the problem with an oil-based stain, oil and water don't mix. And when you have a wood that's full of water and you try and put on an oil-based stain on top of it, a couple things happen. First of all, it's not going to dry very well, but also it's not going to mix with the water that's already in the wood. So you can get blotchiness with this sort of coloration. Now, the real problem, and I've had many, many emails, people asking me, how come when I made my furniture and I put it in the living room and now the finish is lifting off? Well, that's because the wood that you used was too wet. And when you put a polyurethane on top of a wet wood, no matter what, the moisture in that wood is going to wick out to the surface. And when it does, whatever is attached to the wood is going to come loose, because no matter what happens, that water in that wood is going to want to come out to the surface. And that's what happens with polyurethane and film finishes. The film actually comes off. Sometimes it comes off in sheets. Other times it comes off in little chunks where the water sort of concentrates in an area and it makes a hole, it pushes the varathane out, and then it wicks out into the atmosphere. So this is kind of the worst thing that you want to put on a wet wood, is any kind of a polyurethane or varathane. Now, if you want to color wood, one of the best things you can use is a water-based dye. These are aniline dyes, and they tend to mix okay with the wood. The problem comes after you've stained something and you're still dealing with wet wood. Maybe you've put some dye on your wood and now it's a day later and it's dry. But guess what? Your wood is probably still dry. And now you're thinking about, well, maybe I'll put on an oil base, some kind of an oil based, and this is like a tung oil type of finish. I'll put or a hard wax oil like an Osmo. I'll put one of these on. Here's the problem with putting anything like this on wet wood. These finishes will tend to allow moisture to go through, so they won't break down and flake off like a polyurethane will. But what will happen with these, and I just saw another example of this just a couple of days ago. Somebody said, you know, what's going on with my furniture here? And they had used hard wax oil on it. Because there's moisture in the wood, that moisture will wick through these oils, and sometimes you can end up with molds and mildews that form sort of between the Osmo and the wood. And the only way of fixing those is to sand that down, let the wood dry out, and do another coating of it. So there's nothing that you can put on wet wood that's going to be absolutely foolproof. Somewhere you're probably going to end up with problems. So you're probably wondering, so, well, what can I do? I still want to hone my woodworking skills, and construction lumber is less expensive. What can I make out of it that I can use? Well, there's lots of things that you can do with it. You just need to kind of think about what the uses are going to be for it. I still use it to make machine stands. I glue all of my joints together so it's nice and strong, because they get moved around a lot, and construction grade lumber is not that strong, so it really needs to be glued. But you can make sawhorses, you can make wood racks, shelving, rough units for your workshop, outfeed tables, workbenches. There's all sorts of things that you can do with construction grade lumber. You just need to think about what the uses are going to be and what that moisture content is and how you can compensate for that. Well, that concludes my video for today. That's just some of the information that I get emails on, have for years and years and years, questions and problems that people have when they're using construction grade lumber. Now, I also did a video, and I mentioned that earlier in this video, I also did a video on SPF, working with softwood lumbers. That video will show up here. It's probably a good idea for you to go and have a look at that. And this video, along with that one, will give you much better information on using softwoods. I'm Colin Kennett for Woodwork Web. Thanks for watching.